Russia is accusing a Hunter Biden-linked company of bankrolling terrorist activity. Moscow's investigative committee released a press release Tuesday alleging that Ukrainian energy company Burisma sponsored terrorist activity in Russia. What's more, they claim that U.S. officials have funneled money to Burisma to fund terrorism there. According to reports, the allegations have been made with no evidence.
The probe follows Russia's continued blame of Ukraine and the West being involved in the grisly attacks at a concert hall in the Russian capital that killed 144 people. Now, asked about the rumblings from Russia, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan dismissed it entirely during a press briefing yesterday.
It's nonsense. Russia knows that it was ISIS who committed the attack in Moscow. We know it was ISIS who committed the attack in Moscow. We warned Russia of an impending terrorist attack in Moscow, and all of the rest of this is noise.
In other Hunter Biden news, NPR intentionally cast aside the Hunter Biden laptop story. At least that's what veteran journalist Yuri Berliner wrote in Bari Weiss's news site, The Free Press. Briahna, who's been a reporter at NPR for 25 years, blasted the broadcaster for, quote, turning a blind eye on the laptop bombshell, saying it was done to avoid helping Donald Trump. NPR responded, quote, I and my colleagues on the leadership team strongly disagree with Yuri's assessment of the quality of our journalism and the integrity of our newsroom processes. We're proud to stand behind the exceptional work that our desks and shows do to cover a wide range of challenging stories. We believe that inclusion among our staff, with our sourcing and our overall coverage, is critical to telling the nuanced stories of this country and our world.
So let's start with the accusations up top. Look, I mean, to be fair, as Jake Sullivan did correctly point out, the U.S. did say an ISIS terrorist attack is coming, did warn Russia about this. Putin didn't take appropriate action to prevent it. Now he wants to lay the blame on Ukraine and the West. Okay, where's the evidence of that? Again, I'm not going to discount those kinds of things. Obviously, the idea that Russia blew up its own pipeline, Nord Stream, did not turn out to be an accurate prediction. And now I think most people have generally come around to the conclusion that it is most likely the Ukrainians who did it. Now, this attack seems a little bit outside their capabilities as far as I can tell, and ISIS is a terrorist group that carries out attacks like this all the time. We did interview Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis about this, and he had some skepticism because he wasn't sure why ISIS would target Russia. Also, these weren't dedicated ISIS fighters. These were kind of mercenary new recruits who got captured very easily and, frankly, in a very grisly fashion, look like they're having the truth tortured out of them. If torture even works, we'll find out, I guess. But so I understand the skepticism, and all of that is fine.
Right, but also we should clarify that the Russian investigative committee that's made these charges did not mention the Crocus City Hall bombing attack. That is being kind of read into this because this allegation comes after Russian authorities claimed that Ukraine was responsible earlier this week, and so people are kind of connecting the dots. But so far, they haven't explicitly said, according to reporting at least by the Daily Beast, that they mentioned the Crocus City Hall itself. Now, my general thought on this is that you just need evidence. It seems like all of these Hunter Biden stories are a lot of speculation. I'm very thin on the evidence, but we'll continue to report on any if it does, in fact, emerge. Yeah. Moving to the NPR story, what do you make of this allegation that they constructively censored it by simply not covering it?
Yes, this is a great piece in the Free Press. A familiar kind of, I'm a liberal journalist or I'm a liberal professor, but here's what's gone wrong with X, Y, or Z things. It's very much in that mold, but it is highly accurate and informative. I encourage everyone to read it. He talks about, familiar stories that NPR took the maximally kind of like liberal sensibility side of things, uncritically looking at the other side, and ended up looking a little bit embarrassed. True of Lab Leak, true of Russiagate, true of laptop story. When the laptop story happened, and I remember this quote, but he has it here. This is not the first time this quote has been surfaced, but an NPR managing editor saying, in response to saying, we're just not going to cover the Hunter Biden story at all in October 2020. We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not real stories. We don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions. This was after they had interviewed Adam Schiff 25 times about the Russiagate investigation, and then when the Mueller report, did not verify or validate a lot of the most weighty concerns of the Russiagate narrative, then it was just crickets. Then it was just forgotten.
Did the Free Press story do an accounting of whether they ultimately covered Hunter Biden, or if they ever covered Hunter Biden even minimally?
I think it was I think they cover it minimally now, but still there's really nothing to, from a look at this persecution of the Biden family, and pointing out that further evidence to actually impugn Joe Biden has not exactly emerged, that's perfectly fine coverage. He talks about overall, NPR is a publicly funded news outlet that has always been liberal and always had, or for a long while, prior even to this news cycle, has had a heavy liberal readership. But he thinks it's just basically leaned way too far into those kinds of stories.
Yeah, it's certainly not unique to NPR having this kind of selective coverage. It's an interesting world that we live in, where there are all of these news channels that very much are branding themselves as, frankly, liberal or conservative. Ones that try to split the difference, like CNN, are often less successful. But they're, along with that sort of explicitly stated kind of editorial judgment and those editorial goals, there is this kind of fiction that persists, that we're casting balls and strikes when it comes down to the individual journalist. And then there's this way that we characterize outlets as having soft censored or somehow neglected their duties as journalists by not covering certain things. But of course, it is the case that also Fox News isn't covering Donald Trump telling a room full of billionaires that he's not going to lower their taxes last week, right? Yeah. So how much of this is really outrage, and how much of this is, well, of course, NPR is what NPR is. I do think
of course,
the story
NPR gets
is
government funding, and Fox News doesn't.
Sure, but it also gets a lot of private funding. Regrettably, I've been listening to some of these commercials, and they'll say, some oil company brings you this following story, and I'm like, how is this supposed to be a progressive outlet if this is the case? Or some bank is going to bring you the following story, but don't worry about taxing the rich.
There was also a significant DEI component to this. He talks about the DEI efforts that got implemented at NPR, and this one.
What does DEI have to do with, as far as I last checked, a very white male Hunter Biden?
In the wake of George Floyd protests that they said diversity would be our North Star. They started doing unconscious bias trainings. They started. It was incumbent to talk about race in every meeting. And here's something I found interesting that I did not know before, even though this had been public knowledge. They created a centralized tracking system when you interview someone or including original reporting for a story. You must enter that person's gender, race, ethnicity into the computer for it to be.
Yeah, I mean, do you object to that after having seen all the stories recently, in particular, about how there's an incredible disparity between how many Palestinians and Arabs are interviewed for stories about the Israel-Palestine conflict versus how many Jewish people or Israelis are interviewed for those kind of subjects? I mean, it's a long-standing truth that there is an incredible disparity of who's actually cited as authorities in news stories. Regardless of what the subject of the news story is, there's an enormous bias toward, frankly, white subjects for interviews, which is not giving you an accurate picture of what's going on in the world.
I guess. I don't know how I feel about it. I obviously think it's a good thing to interview a range of relevant voices, but there's something I think some people might not want to be bothered to give that information. I mean, what if they don't want to say?
Well, I hate to break it to you, Robby, but at workplaces, a lot of people have to do a lot of things to make sure the business runs most effectively. I'm sure a lot of people don't want to take their time cards or fill out
their pronouns are. They just roll their eyes at it.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry. I thought this was a story. You keep moving the goalpost here, Robby. First, we were talking about whether they didn't cover Hunter Biden, which is fair. Then this became a DEI story, and now you're saying that something about pronouns.
I'm telling you what the person.
Well, you shifted it once, and I gave you my response to it, which is that I think absolutely. I struggle with this in my own coverage on my own show. If I'm not paying attention, I will interview 8 white guys in a row when they're not necessarily the best people for the subject, just because there is a.
Because you're racist?
No. who is accusing anybody of being racist? Bias doesn't always happen because people are affirmatively racist.
Why does that happen then?
It's because there is an asymmetry in terms of who is most active on Twitter, who I see and follow, who has, because of other kind of structural racism issues, has been having the opportunities to write books, to go through PhD programs, to have expertise on various subjects. And if you aren't more resourceful, I also find, frankly, that a lot of times women don't think that they are experts and decline to come on the show when I reach out and ask, which is another kind of real impact. It's not about racism, but it's about a real impact that occurs because of individual behavior that does seem to kind of break down along certain kinds of gender lines. So if I value having diverse perspectives, which I do, because I think you get better news stories that way, then I have to actually do affirmative work.
This tracking system asks for diversity in exactly 3 ways: race, gender, and ethnicity. You don't have to their income status, their class status, what their actual political views are, or education status.
I fully support adding those categories. I completely agree that they should definitely, especially the class status one, and we're seeing this again in a lot of I think that's affecting a lot of the other categories, frankly. Affluent people are getting interviewed, and that's why they are disproportionately white and male. So I completely agree with you. There should be more categories, Robby says, that should be tracked at NPR to ensure there's diversity among the stories that are reported there.
More Rising right after this.